The European Union is officially giving up Russian gas. The EU Council has approved a ban on the import of Russian liquefied natural gas starting January 1st, 2027, and pipeline gas from September 30th, that is, next year. Member states will check the origin of the gas, and violators will face heavy fines. According to Cyprus's Minister of Energy, Michael Domianis, this will make the EU energy market stronger and less dependent on Russia. Ivan Us, economist, expert at United Ukraine, joins us live. Greetings.
Mr. Ola, hello, good afternoon to you, and greetings to all the viewers.
Listen, 2027 is still a ways off, and you could say that a lot can change by then. There might still be loopholes to get around it. From what I understand, many in Europe would like to circumvent it, right?
Absolutely. Mr. Oleg, this is still a decision that will be appealed. As Hungary and Slovakia have already stated, they voted against it. And they specifically want to challenge this decision in court. So, the legal procedures are still in place and haven't been cancelled. We always have to remember that now we just have to wait. A court decision. As for Bonnie, that's actually a good question because, in principle, there is a group of people in the EU who say that we need to refuse. At the same time, there are other countries suggesting that it's not just those who voted against. And others who will say, let's not make any sudden moves, break time equals 0.5s / let's still try to find some viable opportunities to preserve the existing Russian presence. And this will directly affect the prospects of signing a peace agreement, if it does happen. So for these countries, the main idea will be to use the topic of advancing peace negotiations as a way to purchase Russian resources. By the way, it's also important to continually remind Ukraine's American partners, or rather, Ukraine's partners in the United States, break time equals 0.5s / that while they are pressuring Ukraine about peace and possible future deals with Russia, they are overlooking the fact that as soon as this formal peace is signed, then Europe will go back to buying Russian hydrocarbons and will stop purchasing American ones. In other words, the United States must clearly understand the risks for themselves if they continue to pressure Ukraine and essentially force it to capitulate. Nevertheless, although this statement has been made, it cannot be called unexpected. The European Union has long since stated that it intends to give up Russian energy sources, that is, hydrocarbons. And this will not be for a certain period. It will not be just while the war lasts. It will be permanent. In other words, this is a strategic decision that the EU should no longer be dependent on Russia. This is undoubtedly a negative signal to Russian markets, which, let's say, were really hoping that Russia would return to the EU. On the European market, that all restrictions would be lifted. Now, most likely, they will not be lifted. We will see how the court proceeds, if it happens at all, and to what extent the EU will actually implement what was discussed today.
Do you see any attempts, any efforts by the Russians to push the issues of trade and gas into the so-called negotiation process, and to make this one of the... So yes, it's absolutely illogical, I realize that, because we're talking about security guarantees for Ukraine, about the Russian-Ukrainian war. But we are dealing with the Russians, and I do not rule out that, in a hybrid way, they will at least try to push this into possible points, into certain conditions.
Of course, that is, from the Russian point of view. Refusing Russian gas is a sanction, and they say, if we make peace, the sanctions should be lifted. In other words, the Russians don't want to admit that this is a decision of the European Union, to refuse Russian hydrocarbons regardless of whether there are sanctions or not. They say that yes, all these restrictions are the result of sanctions. Accordingly, if we sign a peace agreement, the sanctions should be lifted. Thank you. And there should be no refusal of Russian hydrocarbons, because from their point of view, this is part of the sanctions pressure. And here it is very important for the EU to constantly emphasize what it is doing now, that this is not related at all to the war in Ukraine. It is connected to the European Union's development strategy, which does not want to remain dependent on Russia, just as it was before the start of the full-scale war. So there are certain specific aspects here, and for the European Union, of course, it is highly undesirable for such dependence to persist, whether it concerns hydrocarbons or many other goods. Many other components of economic life break time equals 0.5s / where certain external players can influence the EU precisely because they have such opportunities.
Previously, we have already reported on the theft of grain by the Russians from the occupied territories. The total amount there is over 2 million tons. Well, we can just imagine it. Here, of course, there is this so-called military component, because they, since they control these territories, well, they physically have the ability to transport it out. Outside the law, outside the norm, but they can simply do it physically. What about trade restrictions and, in fact, those sales markets, the markets where the Russians are trying to supply this grain? Can we actually have any influence from that side?
Frankly, it's very difficult. Why? Because no matter what, food is a component of global food security. And if we strictly demand and prevent these goods from entering global markets, we will get a response from our partners. What, do you want us to starve to death? We need these goods. So here, the only thing to understand is that, unfortunately, Russia will do this. But when it comes to payments for these goods, this is where we need to make sure that it's not 100% of the money going to Russia. That is, ideally, all of the money would stay in Ukraine. It's unlikely that Russia would then supply these products, but at the very least, we need to understand the scheme by which Russia takes stolen products from Ukraine and sells them, making money from it, with 100% of the profits going there. This does not suit Ukraine. And we need to look for certain compromise options, the essence of which should be that if Russia does end up selling these products, it will only receive a percentage of the proceeds. I understand that from a legal standpoint, this may not be entirely correct, because in fact, by doing so, we are essentially giving Russia legal grounds to sell stolen Ukrainian products. But we don't want a situation where Russia won't produce them, the world won't receive these products, and Ukraine won't make any money either. So here, after all, there may be certain painful compromises. The point being that we will ask for a certain share of the total amount. But again, we need to consult with lawyers, because under no circumstances should this serve as recognition from Ukraine of the occupation of domestic territories by the Russian Federation, and only as a temporary measure that exists precisely until Ukraine regains control over these territories.
Thank you for the conversation and for finding the time. Ivan Us, PhD in economics, associate expert at the Analytical Center United Ukraine, was just live with us.